The next panel is here to offer you some bravado. This is the Emerging Voices panel, and they are here to deliver declarations and have a conversation. This literally is the next generation of critical thinkers who will be coming onto the stage. There are 6 Olmsted scholars who will be joining me out here shortly. Hopefully by now, you know what an Olmsted scholar is. An Olmsted scholar, just in case you don't know, is nominated by a university, an undergraduate and graduate accredited university across the United States and Canada. They are an outstanding student, and we now are entering our 9th year. We have nearly 400 Olmsted scholars. So Barbara might kick me off of the board when I say this, because we haven't discussed this publicly, but one of the things that I just heard is we need to take the Olmsted Scholars Program on a greater international venue. I think that's one of the recommendations that we will need to look at moving forward. So in order to be considered for the Emerging Voices panel, each of the Olmsted scholars had to submit their own 1,000-word declaration. Yes, just like the folks yesterday. Their selection was through a juried panel, and we chose them. They were chosen through this jury, by this jury, for originality, clarity, and diversity of ideas. So what I'd like to do is to introduce them to you one by one in the order in which they're going to be addressing you today. So first of all, Joanna Karaman was a 2015 Olmsted Scholar from the University of Pennsylvania, where she received her MLA and MArch. She currently is a landscape designer at Olin. Next is Nina Chase, who's the 2009 Olmsted Scholar from West Virginia University, where she received her BLA and went on subsequently to earn her MLA from Harvard University. She's currently employed at Riverlife. Sarah Primeau is the 2011 Olmsted Scholar finalist. She's from the University of British Columbia, currently working with space-to-place design. Scott Irvine, who's the 2015 Olmsted Scholar from the University of Manitoba, is matriculating this year. Tim Mollette-Parks, the 2009 Olmsted Scholar finalist from the University of California, Berkeley, currently an associate principal with Methuen. And finally, Azzurra, the 2016 National Olmsted Scholar, just graduated from Harvard University this year. Please welcome the scholars. So things look a little bit different up here. They're standing. They wanted to stand because this is a statement that they are going to be making that they stand for. They have chosen to not sit down, which they view as a passive act, but in fact want to do something active. Next, the podium. It's transparent. They don't want to stand behind something opaque. They want to be incredibly transparent in the delivery of their messages. So please listen carefully to what they have to say. You're going to hear very exciting things, punchy declarations, and you might even think that there's an echo in the room because you've heard some of these things before, but they sound perhaps a little bit differently. Laurie, I think yesterday said, you know, nothing's really new. It's what you do with it. And so these scholars are going to talk about what they're doing with it. You're going to hear declarations on time-based media, on constructed ecologies, on tactical urbanism, on epistemic rifts, on listening through cacophonous veils, and finally on critical ethnography. So let's get started with Joanna.
The Declaration of Concern in 1966 called for a nationwide system for communicating the results of research, example, and good practice. In its wake, our challenge as landscape architects is to operate at the forefront of design, changing perceptions and leveraging public will towards an inspired response in the face of this century's environmental threats. First, we need to be honest about the way we represent and ultimately build our future landscapes. The homogenized green static image fails to capture the full range of complexities of landscapes at risk today. Time-based media can tap into sensory qualities of a place and helps form our understanding even before the first lines are drawn. In these cinematic moments, we feel instantly connected to the narrative of a community or place. We become invested, we want to engage, adapt, and ensure its future. In practice, these initial impressions are often obscured by technicalities and timelines, but we must nurture this wonder in communicating the value of our work. Secondly, the real power in new methods of representation is accessibility. The general public may not understand a technical section or plan, but a short film can quickly be understood by all, capture emotion, and even help spark new ideas. People value what they can see and understand. This kind of pointed communication both inspires awe and implies urgency. Ultimately, the way we as landscape architects convey our skill set and intent will dictate our work done in practice. We need to be fluent in the communication and design tools at our disposal in order to be thought leaders and to take our seat at the decision-making table. Rather than an afterthought to design, contemporary media can help shape our research and design methods and strengthen the place of the environment in the minds of the public today. Thank you.
So Joanna, my question to you is, how do you think we need to represent landscapes differently so that we can communicate more honestly about our future landscape designs?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think that first we need to rethink our approach to representation and rethink how we define it. It's not just a byproduct of design. It's not like the bread and butter of our work. It's really just a way of seeing the world and the life within it, so that we need to kind of look at it more in the beginning of the design process. And further, while we're creating this, we need to be asking ourselves questions like, who is this speaking to? What communities or ecologies are being represented and included? And does this actually express the volatility of landscapes in this era of climate change, from conditions under inundation of storm surges to extreme drought? And finally, I think that it's more than just trying to represent a new technique or a new trick. I'm trying to think of ways to find opportunities to work further upstream in the design process and kind of create more visibility and kind of potentially even change our modes of practice today. I think as students coming out of school, we're already equipped with all these great communication and presentation skills. And while we're gathering our experience by working or in the built environment, we can kind of tap into these immediately after graduating to advocate for all the things like leadership, equity, and culture in our work now rather than later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Nina. The clicker. Oh, yeah.
First, I want to say thank you to Joanna for a great introduction, and Cindy for organizing this panel, and a very quick thank you to LAF for bringing us all here, all together in one room for a weekend. It's very impressive to see emerging, established, our icons here. So thank you. Olmsted Scholarship would not be possible without LAF, so we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for them, so thank you. So my declaration proposes that as a profession, we capitalize on the recent resurgence of fun. Pop-up parks, inflatable art, parklets, DIY bike lanes. These short-term experimental open spaces implemented under the umbrellas of prototyping and placemaking and tactical urbanism have been thrust into the collective consciousness as places to test new modes of urbanism. Prototyping helps frame the process of city building as participatory, playful, and chock full of experimental landscapes. Landscape architects have long advocated for the benefits of phasing and flexibility in open spaces. I like to think that we are the original placemakers. And now with the popularity of public realm prototypes, our creative role is seen as a greater value add to the toolkit of city builders. But the principles of prototyping, quicker, lighter, cheaper, should not be limited to just urban open spaces. Communities are searching for answers to large-scale environmental and societal pressures such as sea level rise, drought, and housing shortages. And landscape architects, as we've heard continuously this weekend, we are poised to heed these calls. And so by applying prototyping's can-do optimistic approach, we have the potential to really galvanize support for long-term strategies well beyond the scale of a parking spot. Take sea level rise, for example. Designers, I'm guilty of this myself, have painted sunny, optimistic visions for our new wet future. But when you ask the average citizen what it means to build a resilient coast, you are met with blank stares. Pilot projects that embody the test before we invest mantra could help synthesize visions toward a landscape-centric future, one where seawalls serve multiple purposes and green infrastructure reigns supreme. Imagine a segment of an existing bulkhead in a city like Boston, temporarily transformed to include seating or recreational features. The existing seawall could provide the necessary protection needed for now in this moment, while a series of new temporary facades could showcase multifunctional alternatives, starting a conversation about what's possible. Now, obviously, prototyping is not a magic elixir for all our urban woes, as we know, but it is a means to an end, a phase in the process toward greater accessibility of ideas, decision-making, and ultimately equitable, vibrant open spaces. By seeding short-term projects, we can ignite long-term transformations. By harnessing the power of the prototype, we can show, not just tell, what's possible for our community's futures. Thank you.
So Nina, my question, in the context of tight public budgets and often low accountability from public agencies, temporary interventions risk becoming sort of an easy way out. So what do you see as the role of the designer in transforming from short-term prototype to long-term investment?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and definitely a concern. Having worked on some tactical urbanism projects, that's a question that comes up. But what we've seen with tactical urbanism and prototyping currently is that it often leads to long-term projects. There was a guerrilla signage campaign in Raleigh that turned into a wayfinding system for the whole city. The pop-up parks that come out of Parking Day have turned into parklets across the country and across the globe. And these are just a few examples, and those are urban examples, but I think there's the opportunity to really scale this up, this idea of testing out ideas before we make costly investments in other ways. And so I think as a designer, our role is to put on our planner hat and to think like what Carl Steinitz was saying at all three scales, starting with the tactical urbanism, which is even a sub-scale, I think, to what he was showing on the screen yesterday, and being able to provide phasing in projects that we're doing and the planning that that takes to say, hey, we need phase 0, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and we can implement that change if we're there early enough and if we're seated at the table as soon as possible.
That's great. Thank you, Nina.
Yeah.
Sarah, welcome.
So as landscape architects, I think we must become deliberate and skillful designers of constructed ecosystems. For too long, we've inadvertently manipulated ecosystems, the flow of water, materials, species, without having the adequate ecological knowledge and without understanding the broader harm or potential benefits of our actions. We've designed landscapes to provide short-term benefits to the human species only, forgetting that our ultimate well-being and quality of life depends on having resilient, functional ecosystems. So in the same way that we've adopted low-impact development and embraced native planting, we now need to embrace a rigorous new approach to ecological design. We need to collaborate more closely with ecologists, and we need to learn how to design landscapes for ecosystem services, to create regenerative, natural systems that produce clean water, fertile soils, and that support a rich web of species, including humans. There are many ways that I think we can do this. First, I think we need to work more ambitiously across scales and move beyond abstract ideas of ecology. We need to advocate for the protection of regional ecological networks while simultaneously translating regional ecological priorities into site-specific, on-the-ground design decisions. Second, we must seek synergies with engineered ecological processes like stormwater management strategies and wastewater treatment systems. This way we can help to create multifunctional infrastructure systems in our city. And third, and equally important, is for us to design opportunities for people to experience natural phenomena in the cities, like fish spawning or watching a beaver build a dam in an urban wetland. These rich experiences help us understand the reality of our interconnected world, and they play an important role in building society's ecological literacy. By fostering these experiences, we can help the public to not only imagine, but to demand a more resilient future. Thank you.
Sarah, my question is, how do you position yourself and the agency of the discipline between making reparations for past and continued environmental degradation and actively creating new kinds of ecological systems?
Good question. In my mind, the two are not really different. I think the idea of reparation is seeking to recreate a species assemblage from a specific point in time, where the idea of creating new ecological systems is more about recognizing the designer's role in creating those systems. But we have to remember that it's really difficult, and as landscape architects that have experience in trying to do restoration, it's extremely difficult to try to recreate a historical ecosystem when the fundamental drivers of that ecosystem are gone. So the flooding, the fire, the carnivores, the large grazers. Without those things, it's hard to sustain the ecosystem. Plus, the site conditions are different, the soil is different, and the climate has changed a lot, especially in cities, and it's continuing to change. So we have to acknowledge that we can't just put together the species and expect to have a functional ecosystem. So instead, I think we need to really ask ourselves, what is the real underlying goals that we have for our site? What are the ecological services that we want the site to produce? What are the target species that we want to be there? And what are the natural phenomena that we want people to experience on our sites? And I think if we start by asking those questions, that in the end we'll be a lot further ahead in designing sustainable and resilient ecosystems.
Thank you, Sarah. Scott.
Landscape architecture has become an urban discipline. A pronounced shift from landscape stewardship towards social stewardship has detached landscape architecture from the rural and the wild. Projects that directly implicate few people are increasingly difficult to justify, despite that our personal and collective values and the identity of nations are predicate upon places outside our quotidian urban environments. Landscape architecture needs to reinstate breadth across the entire spectrum of environments and develop modes of operating that reflect both the intrinsic connections between different environments and our place within them. Landscape architecture has now primarily developed through the lens of cities. Knowledge, ethics, and methods of intervening are now reified in an urban environment. This shift has failed to be applied in kind to the operation of non-urban environments and systems and our place within them. The unprecedented nature of urban environments has narrowed the scope of regionalism to the borders of cities themselves, However, cities are Earth systems and are entwined at all possible physical and temporal scales with the non-urban. Jeremy Vedder's term epistemic rift describes the divide that we have designed between humans and nature. We have developed fundamentally different ways of understanding and operating within each, which drives our response to the Anthropocene. Landscape architecture needs to actualize itself within this ongoing epoch. Beyond a condition to which we respond or to resolve by making reparations, the Anthropocene is something that we continually create. Although his work has generally come to be understood within urban environments, Frederick Law Olmsted was driven foremost by the creation of values. We should reprise a more fundamental role as a discipline that creates values in the landscape, instilling what J.B. Jackson calls a sense of place, a sense of time. Values must be the mechanism by which we operate as landscape architects. Thank you.
Scott, so I'm wondering in the context of the subject of your declaration, how would you define the term wild in the Anthropocene? And how does that affect your definition between the relationship between the wilderness and the urban context?
The wild, I think, has always been understood as an other, as something that we are fundamentally not a part of. However, coming to terms with the Anthropocene is recognizing that, as many people have stated many times, end of story period, we are not separate from nature. And so it's in part accepting that we are an implicit part of wild landscapes. I fundamentally reject the statement that was made yesterday that everything we encounter today is some kind of gradation of an urban condition or a city-type environment. There are certainly, these systems certainly impact the entire world as we encounter it today. There are always going to be places in which we continue to hold very little or no sway whatsoever. Further, everything that we have learned in recent years regarding how Native Americans from North to Central to South America inhabited these lands before they were colonized by Europeans has come to show that massive tracts of these continents were actually highly and very carefully managed ecosystems. And so there's no way to actually fully separate these two things, but it's accepting that we're a part of it and that's where we derive many of our values from. It's hard to walk around any Canadian city and even many American cities without seeing kinds of non-urban environments that are imbued within the cities that we've created.
Okay, Tim.
Hello. The chance to speak here is almost as exciting as it is humbling. It's also a little difficult probably to be the last panel before the champagne pops on a Saturday night. But when I first started to think about approaching a declaration, I started just trying to think about the big cultural shifts of the last 50 years. And my kind of soundbite summary of it is that since the last declaration, it's gotten really noisy out there. All these new technologies have risen up and allowed new and louder voices to emerge, and there are still a lot of good ideas, maybe more good ideas than ever before in the dialogue, but it's all shuffled up in a big deck of pretenders, and it's really hard to parse out what's real and what's substantive. But lucky for us, landscape architects are listeners. We are trained from the beginning to listen to a landscape, to read its patterns of light and water, flora and fauna and people. And in those patterns, we find performance and we find poetry. Thank you, Cindy. And while I think we hear this poetry, I think we're becoming less likely to engage with it. I fear that we're losing our dedication as designers. Our legacy is Olmsted and Lenote and Jekyll and Church and Ferran and Kiley and Halprin. And our conversations need to be not only with everyone in this room, but also with our forebears. We need to ask, how did their work engage form and pattern and scale and tectonics? And then we need to ask if our work is doing the same thing in a way that's just as powerful. And if the answer is no, we need to try again. And we need to try again, and we need to try again. because I don't think we can exchange design skills for rendering skills and pretend they are somehow the same thing. And I believe this because I think the landscapes that are going to be truly sustainable and truly resilient are the ones that are going to be imbued with enough beauty and enough meaning that future generations are not going to be able to part with them. And just to return for a moment to this sort of cacophony of voices out there, just in the 6 or 7 years since I finished the MLA, I've worked on projects with kids and techies and hipsters and mayors and homeless advocates and civil rights activists. And if we listen to their voices, we can find out what they love about their landscapes. And then if we listen to Olmsted and Linode and Kiley, we can find the tools we need to amplify what the kids and the techies love, and we can make it enduring. And I just want to say I want to see us get excited about design again, about materials, about poche, about space making. And for all those voices that are out there, let's focus on designing spaces that are as experientially rich as they are performative. And let's be design leaders that are fueled by a boundless curiosity. Let's lead by listening. Thanks.
Guess what? I have a question for you.
All right.
To be a good listener, which we've talked about, and we've had lots of phone calls over the past few weeks, and Tim's been the best listener of us all. To be a good listener, you have to be a good question asker, I would imagine. And are there questions that you consistently ask when you're faced with all the techies and the hipsters and the crowd that you're working with? Are there questions you consistently ask to be the most effective in a community and the most efficient through a public process?
You know, I think the most important question we can ask is, what questions should we be asking? Because if you're working on a project that is in an estuary, it's a different set of questions than if you're working on a project that's on a coastal prairie. You know, if you know that 50% of the users are living in poverty, that's a completely different set of questions. And, you know, it's asking the same questions over and over again and hoping to get a different answer is one of the definitions of crazy. And the formulaic is something the landscape can never afford to become. And so I think the questions have to be specific. So,
thank you.
Anyway,
Thank you,
thanks.
Tim.
This is just Hi, everyone. Okay, so I'll start. Design is humanistic. Design is political, and at its core, design is a narrative act. With each decision, the landscape architect engages the narratives that live in a site. We are interlocutors. As we continue to craft our roles as spatial and relational thinkers, then, our task remains to first listen to and understand the socio-political narratives that shape our cities, territories, and imaginaries, and to then broaden and challenge those narratives we consider worth expressing. At a time when so many scales of conflict, from climate change to segregation to police brutality, are tied to systems of spatial organization, the landscape embodies our many legacies, and landscape architecture becomes a key tool for advocacy and action. By listening closely and by being intentional, the landscape architect can telescope from the very personal stories that live in place to the colorful collective identities of a community to the broad strokes that paint our urban and national histories. I propose design as critical ethnography. And I propose that we work where the value of ecological recovery can be deeply related to a commitment to social investment and a stand against systemic violence of any kind. Because the same city that to many of us is about gardens and parks and restaurants and cafes and waterfronts is for other people about barren, decimated public space and stunted trees and cracked sidewalks and cycles of disinvestment. So in such contexts, we bear particular responsibility toward crafting memorable sensory experience, fostering environmental stewardship, and evoking something simple yet radical, a meaningful engagement with place and fellow citizens. For when we design, we not only reveal histories, but ignite futures. Spatial quality engenders new forms of interaction. The unexpected promotes openness. Poetry fosters stewardship. We must allow for continued accretion of meaning through time, all while speaking to the legacies, both joyful and painful, embedded in a place. As Robert Smithson observed of Olmsted's work, the most powerful landscape projects are, quote unquote, never finished. They remain carriers of the unexpected and of contradiction at all levels of human activity. I propose that our task for the next century is to craft those vessels for human experience, to foster a life that is not only good, but also aware, dynamic, and joyful. Thank you.
Okay, Azzurra, one of the things you talk about is designing for accretion, which I find really an inspiring notion. Can you talk about how you think that works, maybe what that looks like, maybe a project that you think is a kind of touchstone for that?
Sure. Well, I mean, so accretion, obviously happens through time and is unpredictable. Culture changes, identity changes, places change. So you can't choreograph it, of course. But I think a good design that is, I think, the ingredients are listening, as you've been talking about, and generosity and a humility also when you're approaching a project and a site and a community. I think then you can build sort of this foundation for a deep process of placemaking that will then kind of feed itself. And that will change over time, just as the city around it or the landscape around it will change. So I think it's leaving behind being didactic. Like that's not, I don't think that is the way to go. And I think really sort of, leading by listening and being humble. And I also think actually that, the material of landscape, because it's changing and it's accreting itself. Right. And also because it has such sort of, I'm really interested in how, plants and landscapes have such iconographic sort of cultural power and how we kind of build our identities around landscapes. And you can see that in literature, you can see that in folklore. And so I think, working with the material in a way that really takes advantage of that is also something.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so it's my turn for a question. They have no idea what I'm going to ask them. But presumably you all were at dinner last night, and you should understand at this point my passion for leadership and developing voices. And I'm very curious. Mark Vogt said we were shade-loving creatures as landscape architects. Species, I guess, was the word he used. Marcel Wilson called us reactionary. Okay, those are ouchy kinds of things to say about leaders. I'm curious how you foresee reconciling some of those characterizations. And I'm also curious how you resist, if you will, the pull of professional conventions in that context. So this is very loaded. And yeah, I'm curious. What do you think?
I'm the definition of a shade-seeking species as a ginger, so I relate to that. But personally, a very personal note, I just made the move into the nonprofit world. I was at Sasaki for a number of years in professional practice, and I'm now at River Life, which is a group that advocates for open space on the rivers in Pittsburgh. And my main driver for that was to be physically at the table further upstream in the process of city making and making sure that landscapes are the foundation on which we build our cities, that it's not, somebody said yesterday, it's not the sauce that you pour over the buildings. It's the foundation itself, it's the plate, and then you put everything else on it. And I truly believe that, and I think through that, if there are more people who can operate at that scale within the government and political scene, I think you show value for what we do, and I hire now landscape architects, so it's an incredible position to be in. I think I'm new to it, so I might be totally naive, but I'm excited to be there, and I think hopefully that can help.
Great.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Well, I'll go. I think that being a shade-loving species is not necessarily a bad thing for our profession, because I think that by the nature of our profession, we're not, landscapes architects. It's a much more collaborative approach, and I think there's a form of leadership in collaboration, in sort of not needing to be in the spotlight, to pull everyone along with you, and to share the spotlight. So recognizing that it's not about us, it's about how we facilitate design and facilitate the process. So I think even though we don't do a great job of recognizing our own accomplishments, I think that fundamentally it's not a bad position to be sort of in the background.
I'll always believe that a strong contingent of people working at the very fringes of the discipline is a fundamentally good thing for the entire practice, and I think that it ought to be encouraged for not only students or young practitioners, but everyone to, instead of responding just to charters and to documents that say this is what we ought to be doing, to take the opportunity during every project and define what it is that landscape architecture ought to be doing, or what do you feel that it should be doing, and that's something that should be taken up anew every time that you do a project. And that the studio environments and the MLA programs and the bachelor programs, that encouraging students to go off and find the ways to ask the right kinds of questions and find out what it is that's really driving what we want to do, and to keep students who are graduating sort of at the more radical end of the spectrum.
Anybody else want to take a shot at this?
I just had no idea that was even a characterization, so I guess I was blissfully naive. But I mean, I think if you look around the room today, I don't know. I think we actually have plenty of role models of landscape architects who are taking very, very strong stands, and many of them are women, which I think is, I'm very happy about that. And I think it involves doing that, like looking for work, and not work in like the, maybe just the project way, but like where should we be working? Like defining our, like claiming or defining our ground. I think that is what leadership is in this field, because then I think there is plenty of that ground, and so it will sort of, by claiming it, we can then make a case for it and go for it.
Thank you. That was good. Anybody else want to take a pass at this quickly?
I'll throw out, at the risk of being touchy-feely, I think it just takes courage. I think, a lot of these couple days has been about having courage, and I think those characterizations on the whole, in the aggregate, I think are kind of right on. But I think because as I submit, because we listen, because we know our craft, because we know the landscape, when that is on the table, that's our time to lead. That's our time to display courage and lead everyone else. And so that's my take.
Thank you. Joanna?
Yeah, well, I haven't been in many of the panels because I myself have been interviewing speakers and trying to capture this moment in the profession and kind of keeping true to this kind of like documentary style. And I think that through speaking with one-on-one, I was just really inspired by how well everyone communicates and expresses their ideas, and I think that that's something that could also be very useful. You need to know how to communicate, how to draw, and I think that leading in this profession is not always about being like the loudest in the room, but for me, through my work, it's also about just observing and kind of trying to feel the vitality of a place and addressing major issues in this.
I think the clock is telling us we're terribly over, but I just would like to thank everybody that hosting this panel has been such a pleasure. The conversations have been incredibly rich. We've learned a lot. Thank you for having the courage to submit a declaration and having even greater courage to take 1,000 words down to 200 words and really distill your thinking and being here these 2 days. Thanks very much.
Thank you.